This meeting is going to be a developers panel, so kind of traditional panel format. We have a few speakers here today who volunteered their time from the developer side of the Brownfield world from different perspectives and different kind of areas of that realm to provide their expertise. The way we kind of have this formatted is we have questions to get the conversation started for each panelist. If you do have any questions that you would like to ask or you want asked, feel free to send them in the chat. We will be monitoring that throughout the webinar. And that's all. I think we're ready to go. So our first panelist for today is Laura Redding. She is with the Developers Collaborative. She joined them in 2013 after earning her Master's of Urban Planning and her certificate in Real Estate Finance from the University of Michigan. She brings expertise in managing complex projects, creative problem solving, and successful collaborations. Right now, she manages the Developer Collaborative's Affordable Housing Division, which oversees projects from site selection, approvals, financing, construction management, all the way to successful completion, and then finally turnover to property management. She enjoys building effective project teams to enhance each development, while also keeping in mind the well-being of residents and contributing towards that. Right now, she also serves as the chair of the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition. So that is her background. And the first question we wanted to ask, I would also like to note for the other panelists, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add. So our first question kind of starts around the realm of why Brownfields. So as a developer, Laura, what kind of attracts you to tackle a Brownfield project as opposed to other types of sites?
Yeah, so a lot of times it does depend quite a bit on where the location is. If the municipality is willing to work together and really be a good partner with us on it, sometimes that is, sometimes brownfields are the only available land, and so it's figuring out how to make the most of a particular piece of property. A lot of it does come from strong partnerships.
Okay, so it kind of depends on the town itself, what kind of support systems they have in place, whether that be like incentives or whatnot for the developer in terms of the brownfield sites. For you, does it come and other panelists can feel free to jump in, does it come from a more altruistic kind of place of wanting to see these sites cleaned? Is there a more somewhat of a financial angle, thinking about brownfield sites are initially cheaper to purchase, and then likewise they have that availability of additional funding vehicles and incentives? Do you only look for sites that are shovel ready, or is it a combination of kind of all those things or something else?
Yeah, it really is a combination. Sometimes those are I do a lot of affordable housing, and so sometimes those sites are more affordable to purchase. So that can be, certainly a big help in terms of making these overall budgets work. It also depends on how much work the municipality has done, both in terms of, due diligence and environmental assessments to understand the current situation of the property, the scope of contamination, and what the potential solutions are. And again, knowing and whether or not that cleanup has even, potentially already been done or not. But really trying to kind of understand what the current situation of the site is and how we can make the most of it with the particular community that we're working.
I think that's a really good point with the community too. And what is that generally both the municipal leadership and the community at large has a vested interest in seeing a brownfield cleaned up. So there's kind of that unquantifiable goodwill that you get. So yes, there's a certain amount of altruism in it, but there's also very practical And the only other one thing I would add that we always factor in is that oftentimes brownfield sites have infrastructure in place already that can be reused, whether that's utilities or transportation, or it might even in some communities be an avoidance of impact fees because the historical use that made it into a brownfield, even if it's not there anymore, might still be kind of carried, like say on the sewer shed maps or whatever.
That's interesting. Actually, I never had thought about that before. Having the infrastructure side of things for many of these sites already have those in place, and they might just need a little bit of repair or reconnection. But from the developer side, thinking about what's the financial benefit of things and the logistic benefit of things, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess it would make sense to move on temporarily to our next panelist for the next question, who is Kent Schwendy. So you're up again. So our question, well, let me really quickly do an introduction. So Kent is the president / CEO for the Corporation of Independent Living, the DIL. Throughout his career, he's focused on the creation of walkable, livable, sustainable communities, while trying to do that in a balanced and holistic fashion, with design that accommodates the functional requirements of development without impacting the aesthetic vision. His expertise includes real estate development, site design, mobility planning, green infrastructure, and team leadership. Before joining CIL in 2013 as the COO, Kent worked as a project engineer, eventually rising to the level of senior vice president and a partner of a consulting firm, leading there a team of more than 50 professionals across 6 states in the planning, design, development, and construction of various real estate projects nationwide. Prior to joining this firm, Kent served in the Air Force, where he attained the rank of captain. Among Air Force assignments was a tour as Air Base Combat Engineer at Dover Air Force Base, from where he was deployed in support of Operation Desert Storm, Southern Watch, and Vigilant Warrior. Kent also served as a utility engineer for the New York State Department of Public Service. He's a graduate of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute with a BS in Civil Engineering, and he's a licensed professional engineer and accredited member of the Congress for New Urbanism, a lead accredited professional from the U.S. Green Building Council, and a certified construction specifier from the Construction Specifications Institute. So a lot of background, which I think will be relevant to this next question. This question focuses on kind of relating back to where we started and where Laura kind of brought the conversation with why brownfields. So from thinking about municipalities and developers developing a relationship and building that relationship. So we often hear from municipalities that they struggle to identify viable developers for brownfield projects. How do you recommend starting those relationships, and what makes a community kind of attractive, if you will, to a developer?
I think the important thing is for developers and municipalities to understand each other's goals, and how they're evaluating things. Every developer I've ever met generally thinks that yes or no are really good answers, but maybe is a horrible answer. So one of the things that we look for when we're trying to build a partnership with a municipality is their stability. We want to make sure that people we're talking to are still going to be there the next year when we're trying to actually do the project, and that there's predictability, that they can tell us yes or no. And, yes, if you do X, Y, and Z is a perfectly fine answer, but maybe doesn't really help the developer to figure out what they need to do or to determine whether or not the project is really going to happen. Because if it's a yes, it's a project, you're moving forward. If it's a no, no harm, no foul, you move on to the next project. Maybe developers get stuck there spending money, having carrying costs, not knowing if they have a project. We don't know if it's an investment. And I think towns just realizing that if they want to say no, they should, would be really helpful. It's the maybes that really, really hurt. And then the last thing I'd say is that it's always helpful when municipalities actually recognize the true value of a property. And in order to do that, they have to compare it against what other properties it's competing against. And that's what sometimes puts brownfield at disadvantage, because it may have costs associated with it that are different than a greenfield site next to it, or a greenfield site. And they have to be realistic about that and be willing to come to the table and say, we can help to equalize some of that because we want you on the site or we want it cleaned up. Developers like to hear that.
Is there any other? Oh.
I wouldn't mind adding to Kent's comment there. I think it's a great point. There's sometimes a false sense of value, and the true value is the redevelopment of the property. And if that's the mission, that should be the mission, not necessarily getting dollars for purchasing the property. We often joke, and I'm sure others would agree, that oftentimes the buildings are worth negative dollars, or the property is worth negative dollars. Those negative dollars being the cost to do the remediation. And it's hard for someone to hear that. It's hard for us to say it, but you have to say it.
So on that note, then that kind of leads me to my next part of this question, kind of making up that gap, if you will, that negative, like you said, that negative. Lost my word. That negative starting point financially. So, what local programs, ordinances, initiatives are there any that stand out to you as some that make a big difference in your brownfield redevelopment projects? Are there certain when you're looking at sites and then you're looking at what the community offers? Are there certain programs you really that catch your eye, or that you've really have been helpful to you from the developer side? And this can go to Kent or anybody else who feels like they have a good answer for this one.
I said a lot. I'll let some others ring in if they want. If not, I'm certainly able to answer it. But...
Technically, it's your turn, so it's all you.
Oh, okay. I think I don't really, I like all programs, right? I mean, gap financing is the difference between being a developer or a dreamer. So most developers are really good at sniffing out all the different possibilities. One of the nice things about a municipality who's willing to partner is that they might bring up some of the local ones that the developer wouldn't be familiar with. You know, generally we know about the state programs and we know about some of the regional programs and certainly know about the federal programs, but we don't always know what's available locally. So that's where it could really help for municipalities to come forward and say, you know, hey, we might have some of this funding in these circumstances. Could that help? And we've done that in communities where they didn't necessarily have funding, but they had the availability of doing a TIF and tax incremental financing. And that was enough to kind of, we took the environmental costs and rolled those into a TIF. So there are ways to do this, but it's kind of a partnership and discussion. I have never said no to money.
Sean, Laura?
Yeah, I would just echo what Ken said. Definitely advertise what you have locally for a particular project or within a district. So in Massachusetts, TIFs are associated with employment and tax forgiveness, tax abatement, but also I think a really underutilized tool is district improvement financing, which is how TIFs operate in a lot of other states. So where you can match future private investment, private tax dollars to support public infrastructure and public needs in the short term. So we're working on a project here in East Hampton where a DIF is actually being used up to $3 million to remediate a building demo in order to support 2 private housing development projects on the site. So it'll be a city-led project with reciprocal easements with the private developer, which is a completely locally adopted tool. It doesn't even need state approval. It just needs to have the know-how and the development program in place that matches what's happening in the future on the private side with what's needed in the short term on the public side.
So it's not just about necessarily, although it can include state or federal programs, but even just local programs, ordinances, initiatives that have been very helpful for you in this case, specifically in East Hampton.
And it's actually, we've used that program in every one of our brownfield projects. So we put those plans together for towns. So that's sometimes where we're working both sides, but it's, like I said, it's definitely underutilized in Massachusetts. I think there's probably been about a dozen that have been done in the state, but where they've been really successful. And I also think not only does it show that the town is willing to put financing into it, but it's a signal to developers that this is a priority area of the town, priority parcel, and they're willing to put some skin in the game.
So a reciprocal relationship from almost every side, constantly communicating back and forth, make a partnership in the realest sense of the term. Sounds like is kind of the kind of the common theme across the developers and panelists.
Yeah, and I would also say since so many state and federal programs require a local match, and increasingly it looks like the EPA cleanup grants, I believe, are going to looking for a 20% match this go around. Those types of programs, like DIF in particular, or local funds that are being put up, can help close that gap and actually help you leverage a lot more in grant dollars.
Any other panelists, anything to add?
I'm the same panelist, but I'll just jump on to just something that Sean made me think of was that one thing that can be really helpful too, with especially with the local funding, is some flexibility on the requirements, because one of the challenges of all these different funding sources is balancing all of the requirements. And you know, I said I've never said no to money. That's not actually true. There have been times when I've wanted to participate in a program, but some requirement of it is mutually exclusive to another funding source. And those can be a challenge. So being flexible, or at least listening and recognizing that those constraints have, you know, real implications to the redevelopment is another helpful thing that the municipality can do.
So that kind of made me think about funding stacks in that concept. Is there tools, resources, approaches that you find best for developing those? I know it sounds like Sean mentioned, working interactively back and forth with the community to figure out what works best for them, and then for you as a developer. Is it a similar approach with kind of sounds like what you're saying with the funding stack? Because like you said, they're not all compatible. Is there any other approaches, resources, tips or tricks you might recommend?
No, I think it comes down to shuttle diplomacy. You just have to, you know, you start with the biggest and most restrictive, and you move your way down through the list, and you see how many you can add to the stack, and then you see what the gap is, and then you go back through again, and you just keep doing it until you've got a project that works, or you've got to give up one way or the other.
Any other panelists have anything to add? Awesome. So that kind of brings me to my next subpart of this question, specifically for smaller or rural communities, communities with less local capacity. How do they make themselves competitive when attracting developers? And this,
So I'm not so sure it's really the municipality that needs to be competitive. It's the site. So it really comes down to, is there a place there that makes it valuable? Is there a way that the town or municipality can demonstrate like how that value added? Like I've worked on a lot of ones where we've looked at it and said, this is kind of the hole inside the donut. Like the rest of the community is really nice and it's missing this one piece, and that's going to add great. It's like a, you know, it's a force multiplier when you do that development. So that's because the town did things around it rather than on it. So it's really, how do they bring value to the site? Developers can see value, but it's got to be there.
mm-hmm. Does that normally come in the form of, oh, go ahead, Sean. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think Kent hit on such a good principle in development is try and find the worst property in the best neighborhood. that's a great way to look at a site, especially if good work has been done around it, even if it's not necessarily the vertical construction around the site, but if a lot's been done in the infrastructure, and there's a place there, and you know, the bones are there to do something. I would also, since a lot of the markets that we work in, Western Mass, struggle financially to put necessarily a lot of resources into the property, where they can loosen or make things flexible on the regulatory side with zoning. So where you can really allow, so it's always a struggle when, you know, a town will have a brownfield property and they'll rezone it, but they'll restrict it to just senior housing and no more density than a few units per acre. Well, that's not going to work out for anybody when you have so much upfront pre-development costs that go into the property. So where, which is low cost for the town, but where you can make things more flexible for a developer to really see what kind of massing is needed on the site for it to pencil out.
Does that come, in your experience, more commonly, and for any of the panelists, feel free to jump in, through zoning regulations, planning documents, whether they're regional or local, Is it kind of city specific?
Zoning.
Zoning.
I mean, that's the first. Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody have anything else to add?
And I will say, I don't know how, I obviously very Massachusetts focused, but we have, so Ludlow Mills is our biggest brownfield projects. Now we've got the Munson State Hospital that we're doing here, but it's one of the largest mill projects that the zoning gave us the base district to do commercial, industrial, but actually the housing front came through 40R overlay district, which it basically creates flexible zoning for housing and more of a complete village concept, but it also had the benefits of the town where they got an upfront payment to create the district from the state, and then also a per unit incentive for housing that's created in the district. So at least in Massachusetts, that's one tool that the town can take advantage of to loosen things regulatorily, but also get some funding too.
Yeah. So kind of to kind of the last part of the municipalities and developers relationship building question. For municipalities or entities with an RLF, revolving loan fund, or other local brownfield initiatives, how do they use those to kind of attract developers to their town or their program? The RLF has kind of been a big discussion as of recently. Have any of you had experience with that, or have any recommendations how you can work with a developer as a municipality with those?
We've used them on a few projects. I think the key in some of the communities we worked was making sure, going back to those restrictions, some of them had really onerous restrictions that made it hard to balance with other funding sources. And luckily we were able to get people to kind of release those. But I think sometimes when municipalities set up those programs, they're being a little short-sighted. That I think it was Matt that just said that, you know, the goal is the redevelopment. So let's get out of the way of the redevelopment and enable that. You do have to have, you know, restrictions and guidelines, but try to keep them open enough that developers won't just say, well, it's not worth the trouble.
Does anybody have anything else to add? Awesome. So our next panelist, actually, I should introduce the last two. Since it's kind of become a little collaborative, I'm just going to give a little background on Matt and Sean. Should have done this in the very beginning. So Matt works for Chinburg Properties. He is their Executive Vice President of Development and Asset Management. Matt oversees a team that leads the assessment, planning, permitting, financing of new opportunities for adaptive reuse, acquisition, land development. He is a housing development professional focused on rehabilitating historic properties. So if anybody, we will have some questions about historic sites later, but if anybody from a community with questions about that, this is a great resource. Under Matt's leadership, they have been able to see projects through the development life cycle from acquisition to successful project completion, and then transitioning the property to management or new home sales. Chinburg is vertically integrated, so they focus on housing and mixed-use properties, looking things kind of more holistically in the developer side. The company has been in business for 35 years and has been converting historic buildings into housing for 28 years, starting with its first mill conversion back in 1996. They presently have over 1,800 apartments under their management, and the majority of those are in historic buildings rehabilitated by the Chinburg team. And then Sean, his background, as he said, is in with West Mass Development, so in Massachusetts. He's a land use planner with 10 years of experience in local and regional planning. His focus is in the areas of economic development, mill redevelopment, and adaptive reuse. In his current role as Community Development and Planning Coordinator at West Mass, he's responsible for community outreach, consulting, property master planning, marketing coordination, data research and analysis. In his previous role as Facilities Manager, he was responsible for overseeing tenant relations with the nearly 30 businesses at the Ludlow Mills Historic Complex, which is a very significant development if anybody is familiar, coordinating maintenance and tenant improvement projects, as well as assisting in managing all the redevelopment activities and projects at the site. Prior to joining West Mass, he worked as a planner at both Southwest Region Planning Commission in New Hampshire and the Montechusett Regional Planning Commission in Massachusetts. In these roles, he led a wide range of planning projects and initiatives, including the preparation of community planning documents, strategic plans, master plans, housing production plans, urban renewal plans. He is also experienced in grant writing administration, collecting, analyzing, and graphically representing local and regional data, providing local technical assistance to communities, and trying to help them meet their planning and economic development goals while including community engagement in that process. So since we ended community engagement, Sean, and any other panelist who feels like they have good input on this, in terms of community engagement, how do you see, what can a local government do or a regional planning entity do to assist in public outreach and understanding of the project for the developer side? Is there a way, how can they identify public goals and critical community connections, specifically for historic sites that often have like a deep local meaning? And for, like you were saying, we have a hole in the donut. Often these sites can define the identity of the community. Do you have a process or an approach that you have found that works best for identifying these goals and these connections?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because what I see happen in a lot of communities is they have this property that they've been looking at for a couple decades sitting vacant, and they do design charrettes and they bring in site designers that will do really nice renderings. And I do think that's really valuable to show what's possible for a site and just to get out of looking at the way it is and actually think of something aspirational. But then when you get a real developer on board and actually are working toward a plan, everything is kind of a disappointment if it's not that. So I think that's always a challenge, particularly with these historic sites where people sometimes remember the way they were, not the way they are today. And if there's a lot of contamination or roofs have collapsed and it's just not redevelopable the way it's just, people see a lot of these beautiful buildings that are just in such disrepair that it's really difficult to redevelop. So I think there's no easy answer, and I think it's very site specific, but I think when you have somebody in the room that understands real estate development and understands what can actually pencil out, I think that can always be a really valuable voice in the room. But I do think it's incredibly valuable to see what could be possible given the constraints of the site. I always caution it because I often see some really beautiful designs. Sometimes people put a building right over a stream. It's like, well, you got to work at least probably 100 feet, maybe 200 feet outside of that stream. So it's just, you always have to put some caveats. So laying out realistic renderings, concepts, and having that development voice in the room, I think is valuable.
Muted. Matt, do you have any input on this?
Well,
Historic?
I would add that I think the savvy towns, as Sean is saying, seeks private sector input way before they talk about rezoning, an RFP to sell a property, or any of those things that have to happen on the public level to make it become available. So that's very helpful. And I think there's generally the yes in my backyard movement within a town is helpful. That starts way before a developer like any of us show up. Just an acknowledgement that yes, we want to see smart development. Yes, redeveloping a site that has historically been used, is served by utilities, is served by roads, is the right thing to do for our community, for the environment, for any number of reasons. So that YIMBY movement happens way before we're involved. It's just that's groundswell. And you're seeing it happening now across our region and across the country because, particularly for housing, it's such an issue at the top of everybody's agenda and concerns.
In that realm, it seems like somewhat of a common theme has been the site-specific and community-specific aspect of this. How do you approach identifying what the public goals are and what connections with community organizations, groups, members could be? Is it something you rely more on the municipality to bring you into that conversation? Do you have any recommendations for how they can facilitate that conversation between municipality, developer, community?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'll just take a stab at it answering because I mean, for the most part, for our business, we focus on housing. Housing is an economic engine that's needed, and oftentimes there is some level of mixed use in our properties because they're so massive. Right? As you know, these mill complexes are big, and they're in towns, centers typically, so they can become a de facto main street, although arguably somewhat competes with main street businesses to some degree. Um, so being flexible on percentage of housing versus commercial is great. Being flexible on shared parking so that complementary uses can share a parking lot, so you create smaller parking lots. Those are important tools within the civic toolbox to help developers rehab properties.
Any other panelists have anything to add? Any other input on that?
Maybe
Even
just
more-
to maybe tying two of those thoughts together. In my previous life, I did a lot of design charrettes and planning charrettes, and now as a developer, I see that one of the problems with that is if you don't have the developer at the table, you can establish an expectation that can't be reached. But the flip side of that is that it does engage the community, and you get some really good inputs as to what is missing within the community. So to me, the balance, it all comes down to kind of timing and who's at the table when, because one of our biggest projects was not the project that we thought it was going to be when we went into it, because when we started talking to the community, they identified a completely different need than our data analysis had. And they were right, because they lived there. And we built it based on what they said they needed, and it's been a phenomenal project. So there are benefits. There's risks too. So it's just the timing, I think.
You mentioned risks. That was actually another category of our questions, and I think that might be a good segue into this. What are the biggest risks, and this can be for any of the panelists, from your perspective in brownfield redevelopment? Do you have any strategies you use to mitigate these risks? How can the local government help, if at all?
So right up front, environmental assessments. Absolutely. If you have phase 1, phase 2, HBMA, just as much of that black box that you can kind of clear up for a developer that's looking at a site coming in, understanding what's there for contamination. If it's relatively straightforward to remediate, or if you're getting into a long-term project that's just going to be sunken costs. So yeah, the more that you can make that visible and apparent to a developer, that's huge.
All comes down to time and money.
Oh, go ahead. Does it help you on the community side of things too? Maybe you have more answers or more confidence in how the site is characterized and therefore how you're going to approach it? Or are those two things kind of separate?
I think from a risk standpoint, there are a couple of different ways to handle it. If you characterize it really well, you can decrease the risk. Or if you have a really strong public-private partnership where the municipality says, you know, we think we know what it is, but if we're wrong, we'll find a way to help you get those additional funds. It's not a blank check, but it's a commitment to help if there's additional gaps, that they'll be there. And that can work really well on sites that either are a little less well characterized or have a couple of factors that are one of those where we don't know until we start. And what do we do if? It's nice to know who's on your side.
Yeah.
I will say the model that we have for the Munson State Hospital property, so it's between us and the state, but it's one that I'd love to see if it could be piloted at the municipal level, if there's any case studies that are out there. So we acquired the former state-owned property from DCAM, the state agency, with funding for pre-development work. So The funding came with the property. We submit proposals that are reviewed by the public entity who says, yes, we agree that this is needed to help develop and move the site along. In this case, it's redevelopment planning, but also remediation and demolition work. And within our agreement, we have a reverter clause after a couple of years that if for whatever reason the state or we as a party don't want to move forward with the development, the funds have been spent on the property, but either party could walk away. So it's a complicated arrangement, but it gives us enough assurance that we can really invest in the property, invest our time, and be good stewards of the public dollars. But also, we're not tied. We have enough time to do all the due diligence and work that we need to, and could walk away if things don't work out. You know, and it's especially under a mutual agreement with the public entity. I'm not aware of any municipal examples where that could happen, but we have talked with the community who has a really challenging brownfield to see if they could do an RFP or how that could be positioned municipally, where they have funding that they've already put toward the property, but whether or not that could be tied to a sale, almost as a negative sale where there's funding coming along with it. Just an idea out there that we want to keep exploring.
Along the same lines, if the municipality owns the property already or can take ownership through a tax lien or some other reason why they could take ownership for it, having the municipality seek dollars to invest in remediation beyond just studies, is helpful because it, as he said, it clears up the black box, it answers questions, it resolves things, so that negative dollar property now is to zero.
So that is a common approach that we see often. Pretty decent success where when the municipality takes ownership, there's a lot of benefits to that for the general redevelopment of the Brownfield site because it opens you up to different funding opportunities, for example, EPA grants in certain situations, but it also sounds like from a developer side, usually when the municipality takes place, if they do their own work beforehand and getting the site shovel ready, if you will, assessed, cleaned up to the point where development can kind of happen, is that that sounds like an important factor for kind of common among all the panelists, a common factor that can be important. If the site isn't municipally owned, has that been, in your experience, true that when it's municipally owned, usually it kind of helps that relationship, whether that's between you and the community or you and the municipality? Anybody other panelists had a similar experience or a different take on that?
We've purchased a couple of properties from municipalities, and it's definitely been helpful for them to have the ownership piece help us. You know, gives them more funding opportunities, gives us more funding opportunities. We are not a nonprofit, so you know, it certainly opens up more doors when the municipality can access some of those funds. Yeah.
I would just
Has that been
add that
go ahead.
So I would just add that it's not so much the ownership maybe as the participation, because if they have funds available and they can put them into the project, then the ownership doesn't matter so much. I actually prefer them to not clean it up before we get there, just to have the funds ready, because oftentimes some of our site work that has to be done, those costs can be mitigated through the brownfield cleanup. But if you do the cleanup first and you don't know how to leave the site, then you end up having to re-excavate areas that have been cleaned. And so doing it all together, there's a saving. So it goes back to that kind of finding the partnership and bringing it all together.
Does anybody have anything else to add? Okay, here we go. I have another question actually kind of on this note from the chat. Do you have any advice for a community trying to facilitate the redevelopment of a brownfield where housing may not be a viable option, whether that's for logistical reasons, because it's not something the community is broadly interested in? thinking about commercial developments, recreational developments, light industrial, perhaps?
I think this goes back to knowing the value of the site. You know, the reason we're all kind of talking about residential is right now that's what you can make work. um, one of our board members is famous for saying that the problem with the commercial market is not that we're overbuilt, it's that we're underdemolished. There's just so much out there that it's hard to have value in new. So it's not that developers don't want to do it. It's will the market allow it? So I think it's really, they have to have a clear understanding. In some places it will work, but they really have to have a clear understanding of the market and a realistic expectation of what the value is then.
In your experience, does that normally come through market studies, local planning initiatives, kind of a combination of that, having done your research, your planning beforehand, before the developer comes on in? And then obviously we'll work back and forth, but.
Yeah, I mean, it can be either way. I mean, a lot of municipalities can get out in front of it by having market studies done. The developer is still going to want to do their own. And, you know, that's where having that conversation and saying, well, what were the assumptions? How does this work? How does that work? Are important. But, you know, the community knows that site better than the developer is going to know it to start with. But the developer probably understands the market conditions and what they can bring in a little better. So it's really trusting each other and sharing information and finding something that is reasonable for both. I always think, you know, I don't go into a deal trying to get the best deal. I go into deals trying to make something fair, because I don't want it to be the only thing I do in the community. I want them to think, oh, they took advantage of us. I just need it to be fair. But that means we both have to listen.
Yeah, commercial is very risky, just as a private developer's perspective. So it's very difficult to start a commercially anchored project without pre-leasing to an anchor tenant. So if a commercial use is the goal, then the community would be best served identifying that anchor tenant of scale too. It's got to be a scale. It can't be someone who's going to take 500 square feet in a 500,000 square foot building.
Yeah, Matt's absolutely right. We've had a couple examples where a town has reached out to us and say, hey, we've got this brownfield property that's adjacent to an industrial park. We have an operator there that wants to expand. We don't want to lose them in town. You know, they're thinking about expanding maybe somewhere else. Is there some way that we can work together? They don't want to develop it. They don't want to get into brownfields projects. Is there a role for kind of a middle developer, master developer to come in, help work this out with this tenant in mind? But to do it on speculation is really, really challenging.
I know this comes up very often. Do you see any benefits or anything particular about a recreational reuse? I know that's not as much, or in combination with housing or commercial. Is that something you see as a benefit if the town is interested in putting a park next to housing, or working on that partnership? Is that something you've looked for or had examples where that has worked out well?
I've got a cool example of that in one of our projects. Not that we had anything to do with it, but the adjacency is so cool. We did a mill rehab in Franklin, New Hampshire. And before we looked at the property, there was a gentleman in town who was a whitewater rafting and kayaking enthusiast, an expert, who had a business in town and really wanted to create a man-made rapid in town. And this river that runs by the mill, of course, because rivers run by all mills for the most part. And he somehow found a way to generate public support, state support, federal monies to create this really cool whitewater rafting or whitewater kayaking play area. There's this man-made wave that spins, and you'll see kayakers in there. And then around that, they've created this community of folks who are whitewater enthusiasts. They do events. They have a mountain bike park up the road. But it all adds to the vibe and the value in investing in the community. It just makes our mill rehab that much more special. I always brag about that project because it's so amazing that one person was the engine behind what it seems like just a for fun thing, but it's not just for fun because it does add value to the community.
Yeah, I'll say at the Ludlow Mills, one of the very first projects we did, I mean, the whole campus is 130 acres, and we had one development kind of in the pipeline for a rehabilitation hospital. But one of the first things we did was work with the town to do an easement and a river walk. It was enough away from the buildings that we could still do all the remediation construction work that we needed, but it really brought the public into the site, brought more eyes to the back of the property where we knew we would need a lot of public infrastructure in the future, and we've since built a public road back there. But it was as part of our master plan, we knew we wanted that area to be very visitor friendly. We now have a coffee shop and bagel place right along the river. It was just opening up a whole new side of the property that otherwise was just blight and kind of a dangerous area along the river. But it made it, by that being one of the first investments, really kind of gave a whole other perspective on the entire brownfield.
So it sounds like, going back to community engagement, having that one, and we've seen this with a lot of projects where you have one very loud, passionate voice who's able to rally other community members around a specific reuse, a specific portion of this, and likewise almost regaining that, I don't want to say community trust, but interest, support. Is that something that the panelists have experienced as a kind of a common positive approach to kind of get community support and make sure that what you're showing includes what broadly, I know you can't define the community as a monolithic entity, but very broadly speaking, interest in this site?
I think for the most part, I have seen that play out in a lot of communities, that there's one person or a small group, and I guess like every revolution starts with a small dedicated core of individuals, right? So if you can identify those, and if they're actually speaking for the community, that works. If they are not actually speaking for the community and they're the idea that everybody hates, that's not helpful. I did have one community that I tried to work in and didn't have much success, where it seemed like the community was pretty much equally split on everything. If one group agreed to something, the other one fought against it just out of principle. That's not a good community to try to work in. Settle your differences, decide what you can agree on, and then we can come in. But if someone is always going to be against it just because someone else is for it, it doesn't work.
In your experience, is that something that from a municipal side can be sort of, is that something you lean on the municipality to help facilitate? Or maybe before you get there, the municipality has documented, whether it's through charrettes, public opinion sessions, or is it kind of just case by case?
I think it's case by case. I mean, there are places where they've talked a lot and everybody is kind of speaking, not with one voice, but maybe with one goal in mind. There are other places where they've never had the conversation, but once you start it, it can coalesce quickly. I think it really comes to how tight knit the community is, and if they can come together, then that's helpful.
Anybody else have anything else to add? Cool. So we do have a couple questions in the chat. Let's see. I think, okay, this question seems more relevant to what we've been talking about now that we've been kind of on the community municipal side of things. Whether it's from the community, the municipality, are there kind of common misconceptions about brownfield development that will drive you crazy? And if so, how would you suggest, whether it's preventing, correcting, or kind of facilitating a more nuanced approach, a truthful approach to these misconceptions?
I think Matt said it at the beginning. I think a lot of these properties are overvalued not necessarily by the municipality, but by the current owners. If it's a private owner, I have just one that I'm thinking about where they approached me and they said, "What would you give me for my property?" Thinking with the kind of attitude that they were sitting on a gold mine. And I said, it's probably worth the value of your land minus the value to take down your buildings. It's just, the property's in such rough shape. And I know there's so much there needed for remediation. And yes, there might be some infrastructure available on the road. I don't know the quality of your infrastructure on the site, if it can be reused or re-sleeved or whatever it is. People that are private property owners often think they're sitting on a gold mine with some of these mill properties and brownfield properties.
Maybe to follow on with that, there are also a lot of people, because we talk about brownfield funding programs and people hear about them, they think, oh, it's just a lot of free money for the developers and they're going to get rich and these are easy projects to do because there's so much money. And that's not the case. The money is there because these projects can't happen without them.
Yep.
Are there any common misconceptions from the community side of things that you hear, or like concerns the community has that you have had to address kind of over and over again? And do you have an approach for some of those misconceptions, if at all?
I think everybody wants to know that it was cleaned or remediated to the proper standards. So that's always a concern on the leasing side when you have occupants in it. So working through a program gives you some, and with municipal backing and the such, does help you to present it as, yes, we went through these processes. Here's a permit from this state for agency or the such. So that certainly helps.
I also see another question in the chat along similar lines. From a member of I'm sorry, I don't know what the M is, but a regional planning commission. They say they often struggle finding developers and contact information. Do you have an approach for the communities looking for developers, how to find the developer that will fit their community, their needs? Is that whether that's through just a general kind of ethos or resources that you recommend, without maybe not your own company website, but more broadly speaking?
A great question. I haven't looked for a developer because I am one, so I don't know how people find us.
Well, like, how do you look for a civil engineer? You look at the planning board minutes to see who's the person in that town that does civil design. So it's kind of the same thing, I guess. You look at planning board minutes across the region to see who's presenting cool projects.
Or maybe, yeah, that's the thing. Look for projects that you like and then find out who the developer was.
Reaching out to other communities who have had similar projects that have been done in a way that's sort of what you're looking for, what the community is looking for. So in the last, we got about 10 minutes left, and I just wanted to come back real quick to historic sites, because I think we kind of danced around this a little bit without going too specific about historic sites. So are there historic preservation funding or incentives that you really look for? And how do you kind of balance specifically for historic sites, the fundings and the incentives versus the kind of regulations and restrictions that come with them, whether it's for housing development or affordable housing, or just kind of generally speaking? Is there an approach to this you look for?
What's nice about historic sites is that there's typically less site work and soil export that needs to happen. And that's where, I see costs really get pretty expensive. Abatement costs can be qualified expenses for historic tax credits, so that helps a bit. But I typically haven't found there to be too many conflicts between NPS standards and brownfields remediation in general.
Yeah, I found they tend to play pretty well together and they complement each other really. I mean, I think the other thing from the developer standpoint, we talked about what is the value of a place. Well, in order to be better, you first have to be different. And one of the nice things about historic sites is that they tend to have a character and a sense of place that otherwise a developer has to invent. So if it's something that brings value in that way, that, you know, some image that's well known, or if it's because there's a, you know, a tower on the building that everybody recognizes, or it's a wayfinding throughout the community or something like that, any of those things can help with marketing the site later, because we have to come up with a way to sell it, to get it to fill up. And those things tend to exist more in a historic structure because people are already aware of it and it already has a history. Otherwise, we have to invent something. And when I did master planning in charrettes, that was always the challenge. If we were, you know, a greenfield site in the middle of the Midwest, what's its image going to be? What character are we going to create? As opposed to, this is where, you know, bells were made for the Civil War and put on horse harnesses. Okay, we could play with that, you know. So it's that tie to history gives you a better future as well.
That actually ties in. One of the questions I was going to ask was how you balance that history and sense of place, sort of the need to adapt to the current market and uses. But it sounds like, Kent, your experience has kind of been that it almost helps you because it, like you said, allows you to create a story regardless of what the use is, or what the market needs are in that community.
Yeah, I mean, most historic sites were built to be adaptable. So they already have a history of evolving. So you just want to find the next evolution for it and not erase the history, but evolve it to a modern use and to modernize the facilities so that people want to be there. But there's almost always a way to do that within it. It's not always the most economical way to do it. But that's where, if you can balance that against something else, and if you can get, say, historic tax credits, that helps to offset some of that.
I have another question from the chat, and as you can tell, this is a Wayne question. So with your crystal ball, is the prospect for redevelopment of brownfields getting better, generally speaking? And if so, what changes are making that difference? Do you think it's education, legislation, community acceptance, something else?
Can I say yes and no? I mean,
Absolutely.
I think there are some places and there's some ways that it is getting easier, certainly more mainstream. But on the other hand, there are reasons that makes things more difficult because it enhances some of those misperceptions that makes it hard to do the projects. So it's almost like it's becoming more normal, and by becoming more normal, it's becoming harder. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing that, but that's kind of been my feeling.
And the
I think even
availability of funding
go ahead.
is such a huge variable.
For affordable housing projects, Laura, I know there's often misconceptions about what that means, what the kind of the programs behind that are doing or trying to do. Do you have any approaches that communities have used, or kind of ways of talking about affordable housing, whether that's education or different local incentives, really anything that's you've seen been a positive for helping that community perception in communities?
Yeah, a lot of times it's being able to, relate what 60% AMI is in real life, who those people are, what jobs they're holding, how they're contributing to their community but can't afford to live in that community. A lot of it comes down to that sort of storytelling piece and just being able to help people relate to what those numbers mean.
One more question from the chat. This one is a little specific, but I'll see if I can broaden it a little bit. So, talking about in situ soil remediation options versus having excavation, hauling, are there specific cleanup approaches that have worked best for you, or is it I might suspect, and I could be wrong, more of a site-by-site basis and working with the community for what is not just most affordable, but most conducive to the specific redevelopment you're going for.
Yeah, I think they're spot on. It's always totally contextual. The one additional piece I would add, kind of stealing this from Matt, but you have to have comfort of the people who are going to be there afterwards too.
Right.
So sometimes we pick a remediation method not based on what's most economical in the short term, but what's most marketable in the long term. So it really varies, in my opinion, really varies site by site, constituent by constituent. I mean, it's really, everything has to be contextualized.
In the last 10 minutes here, I guess we can probably open things up a little bit. If anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But for the 4 panelists in the last 10 minutes here, is there anything you would want to add, communicate to municipalities, regional planning entities, any mile high kind of final statements or messages? Any highlights from this that maybe have come up during the discussion?
One thing that occurs to me that maybe people don't realize is that, not all developers want to do brownfield redevelopment. So it's not just finding a developer, it's finding a developer who's experienced and willing to do the type of project you have. We run into every now and then a community that has been trying to partner, but they keep trying to partner with people who don't want to do brownfields, and they try to hide the fact that it's contaminated. It's like, well, it's the wrong approach. Find somebody who the contamination doesn't scare, and that's why we're all here on this panel, right? But not every developer feels that way.
It sounds like, going back to an earlier discussion, the best way to do that, unless you guys have a better, like you said, you're from the developer side, so you get called in, not the other way around. But it sounds like a really solid approach for that, especially as brownfield redevelopment projects are increasingly going from point A to the final point. It sounds like the best approach for that, or a really solid one, is to reach out to regional planning entities, surrounding communities who have done similar brownfield projects in a way that kind of is similar to what you're looking for in your community, and connecting with them, seeing not just who is their developer, but how did they approach that relationship with the developer, and building those connections and those contacts to find a developer that fits your site, specifically a brownfield site, and then what you're looking to have happen at that site. Did any other panelists have anything to add? Or do you have anything else to add? Is there any more questions from participants you just wanted to throw in the chat?
I was just going to add something to what you just said. It made me think of, it's not a project that I worked on, but one I was really impressed with in Vermont, where there was a local developer who wanted to do a project and had the local contacts and the support of the municipality and everything else, but it was a brownfield site and they didn't have the expertise for brownfields. And they ended up partnering with a larger brownfield developer to bring that expertise. And I don't know exactly how they set it up as a joint venture or whatever else, but I do know that they did more projects together afterwards. So they must have found a way to make that work. So that's another thing that the municipality might be able to help foster, is it can go either way. You could have a developer coming in who says, well, I want a local connection though, because we don't know the community. Well, maybe there's a local developer they could connect them with. So it doesn't always have to be one person, I guess, is my point.
It takes a village. Anything in the chat? For anybody watching, Matt put a link to the Whitewater Park he was talking about in Franklin, New Hampshire. That should also be available once this is posted. So I think we're right about at 1:15. So unless there's anything anybody else wanted to add? we can wrap things up here. Seriously, thank you very much for taking your time to share this with the participants. This really, I said it, I really do mean, has been a very common question. And this has been informative just for me, and how I and the TAB team can communicate this conversation to communities. And I'm hoping for the communities and the planning entities and whoever else was able to make it onto this. I hope this was a helpful firsthand kind of answer to some of these questions. So thank you very much. It's been very informative.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Take care.
Bye.